Good Morgen. That was the end of my German. Except for Bundesliga. Let's do a show of hands. Who thinks the Bundesliga is the best professional soccer league in the world? Premiership in England? La Liga in Spain? No one is voting. Spain, there's a Spanish fellow. Yeah? Yeah? Serie A in Italy? No? Not a lot of votes. Not a lot of football fans. Okay. I apologize for my English and not being multilingual as you are. I am deeply honored, Professor, at the invitation to contribute here and to share some perspectives on this issue of risk that I think I find important for my life, and hopefully you will for yours as citizens individually and citizens of a society. By the way, I will try to go slowly enough that wherever the translator is, are you caught up to me now? He can understand what I am saying. There is a brain that is working very hard. Let me see if I can bring together a few of the ideas that have been shared already. Dr. Bauman said that we live our lives, if I may, sir, cursed by the awareness that they will end, or compelled by our consciousness that life will end. And we are still animals, mostly, not creatures of our brain. Mostly we are animals of our instincts and evolution. And one of the tools that we use to try to deal with the fact that we know we will die is our reason. We're all smart, conscious, thinking people in this room by virtue of our being here. And we try to advance our quality of life, create modernities, deal with the uncertainties of a liquid world by being smart, figuring things out. Here's the hidden risk, a very serious risk that is not so obvious, but may be one of our biggest risks of all. We are not as smart as we think we are. We, me too. I am not an academic, though I'm an instructor at Harvard, but my background is in journalism. And what I'm about to offer is the study from various fields of science about why our perception of risk very often seems not to match the evidence of the actual risk. I call this phenomenon in my book, the name of the book is later, the perception gap. With many risks, we are more afraid than the evidence says we need to be. And with many risks, most of the big ones, we are not as afraid as the evidence says we should be. Why is that for a species that is so smart? Listen to these brilliant thinkers in this room. The reason is, from many fields of science, that the perception of risk is not a matter of pure reason. Thinking, conscious, purposeful, objective analysis. So let me start then with this quote, and I hope you all remember this about yourselves and your fellow citizens of the world. Our brain is only the organ with which we think we think. Most of what goes on in our brain happens below, that turns into our behaviors. and our choices and our ideas happens below conscious reason. I can't commend to you enough a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, Kahneman. It is out only 6 months, and it is a classic work about how your decision-making works outside your awareness. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in 2002 in economics for figuring out the psychology of why we all make stupid choices with money. But it applies to risk as well. Please get that book if you want to be an informed person about your own thinking. Let me demonstrate first for you what Herbert Simon, a brilliant man in the 50s, said, that we live our lives in conditions of bounded rationality. That means our ability to be perfectly rational is limited, bounded, by 3 things. We don't usually have all the facts when we have to make a decision, nor the time to go to Google and look them all up, or the intelligence to understand them all. Let me ask you a question with a show of hands. Who thinks that biological terrorism is a serious threat to public health? There's no right or wrong here. Okay, yes? Who thinks that genetically modified food is a serious threat to public health? Yvonne, you should raise your hand. You're a Greenpeace member, yes. Okay. Who thinks that using your mobile phone while you drive is a serious threat to public health? And you do it. And you do it. Yeah. Now here's the important question for people who think we're smart and rational. Raise your hand if you think you had all the facts you needed to make a fully informed choice about the other 3 questions. Well, you're a journalist, of course you would. And I won't embarrass my fellow speaker by asking you about all the facts about all 3, because I could come up with facts that you don't know. Here's what we do. I ask you to decide. This is how normal life is. You are presented with choices and ideas all the time, and you have to make sense of them in conditions of bounded rationality when you don't have all the information or all the time or all the training to understand the information, but you have to decide, just like I did now. We have developed instinctive ways of making sense of partial information and turning it into what we decide and believe. But you notice I said instinctive. You didn't do it just based on the facts. It came from other powers that we have evolved. Now, let's say you have all the facts. This is another book that I strongly recommend that you get. Descartes' Error by Antonio Damasio. Let me describe to you one principal character in the book. Damasio is a neuroscientist, and he studied a man named Eliot. Eliot came to him because his life was dysfunctional. He couldn't keep a job, he couldn't keep friends, he lost many spouses. He was not able to behave what we would call rationally, normally. So the scientists gave him tests of his intelligence. Here are the facts. What is your IQ? And he passed them all brilliantly. But it turns out that he had had an operation in his brain to save his life that had disconnected the part of the brain behind our forehead where we make a lot of conscious decisions. It's called the prefrontal cortex. And the part of our brain on the brainstem, which is much older and more ancient, called the limbic area. It includes several areas that turn information into our feelings. That was disconnected. The part where we think could no longer talk to the part where we feel. And it turned out that was the problem for Eliot. Eliot could understand all the facts and repeat them, but without the ability to communicate between the fact part of the brain and the feelings part of the brain, the facts had no meaning. The facts had no good or bad, no pro or con. A decision to wear a red sweater or a black sweater that we would make based on how does it look and so forth, he could not make that decision. 9:30 or 10:30 for an appointment in the morning, I don't want to wake up so early, I want to get it over with early, all of these feelings sorts of qualities, they were not available to his decision making. So in the purest sense, and Descartes and Damasio cites this, rationality does not mean what we think it means, just pure factual thinking. Because Eliot could not behave rationally, even though he had his full mental, factual faculties. Facts are meaningless ones and zeros in our mental computer until we run them through the software of how those facts feel. That's very important to people who think we're purely rational, and by that we're just fact-based. Now I want to describe to you a little bit of neuroscience about how we respond to risk. In fact, how we respond to most things, but my topic here is risk. I will talk you through the parts of this slide that matter, but it's not complicated. Let's see, will you be able to hear me still if I walk away from the microphone but speak loudly? No, they're recording me. Okay. The outer part of the brain with all the wrinkles is the cortex. See, I have a halftime signal. I don't even get a yellow card yet. I haven't fouled yet, but I'm at halftime. That's good. Thank you. The cortex is where, among other things, we do our cognitive thinking. That's all you need to know about that. The hypothalamus is a region in the brain that works like a relay station when any information comes in from the outside world or a memory inside. The first place it goes for dispatching onward to other parts of the brain is a region called the thalamus, and there's a small organ inside it called the hypothalamus that squirts out some drugs, some hormones and things. That's all you need to know about the hypothalamus. It's like a relay. The third organ that matters the most for risk is called, it's on the bottom, it's called the amygdala. How many of you have heard of the amygdala? You really need one of these to stay alive. It probably is where most of our emotions actually begin, where the signal first goes out in the brain that causes changes in the body that then, when we are aware of them, we describe later as fear or love or happiness. These conscious expressions of our emotions are only the after-the-fact conscious realization that our body has already started a response that we describe as fear or love. So the amygdala is the part of the brain, the special cells, where when it gets certain information, and we don't know how this works exactly, it sends out a signal, those red lines, that turns up your heart and makes you more alert, that we call the fight or flight response. You understand that language? The instinctive first fear response. Now, I could throw a pen at the professor right now and she would have one of these. That would start in the amygdala. I won't, because she's paying for my trip. But that's all I want you to understand. The cortex is where we think. The blue part of the cortex is the part where we make conscious decisions, the prefrontal cortex. The hypothalamus is a relay, and the amygdala is the organ where when it gets information, it sends out the red lines of a fear response. The blue lines now are the cortex saying, I learned from a sociologist today some ideas about modernity. That's conscious information that in part goes to my amygdala and other parts of the brain. The one thing I want you to notice out of this slide is, well, two things. First, when we first see a snake, that's the little line in the eyeball, it would be like me throwing a pen at you. We would have an instinctive response. Most of us would respond to a snake or heights or certain common fears instinctively. What happens is the information goes up, in this case vision, the optic nerve to the thalamus, and it sends the information to the amygdala by that little yellow line. See the little yellow line? And it sends that same information out to the prefrontal cortex on that longer yellow line. The cortex is where we think, and the amygdala is where we fear. Where does the information arrive first? That doesn't sound very rational, does it? That doesn't sound like we're using conscious cortical reason, does it? No, but that's how our brain is built. Now, a little bit later, 22 milliseconds later, the prefrontal cortex says, thank you for the information. I have thought it over, and I am sending my analysis of the information, my conscious reasoning analysis, to the amygdala by the blue line. The blue line from the blue part of the forehead back down to the amygdala. You see this blue line on the bottom. Now the amygdala has both the instinctive response and the fact that you know that I probably wasn't going to poke your eye out with a pen because you're a reasoning person also. But the red lines of fear have already started before the facts arrive. When the little yellow line from the hypothalamus hits the amygdala, it sends out the alert. Then the facts come in. And in the ongoing dynamic of our response to risk information about climate change or snakes, there are more red lines going out from the amygdala stimulating a feeling response, an instinctive response. Then there are blue lines coming in from the cortex saying, here are the facts. Now you can think things through. This is the challenge, Professor Schoberg, of mind over matter. Our brain is not built that way. Our brain can reason, and we need it to, but it's not built that way in the first case. It simply is not. We pay more attention to the feelings of a situation than the facts of them. That's simply how our brain has evolved. Now, how do we make quick feeling sense of facts? We use there's Daniel Kahneman, who wrote that book, Thinking Fast and Slow, and his colleague. These were both Israeli military people, and Amos Tversky has passed away. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize. They have come up with a lot of what are called heuristics and biases, or mental shortcuts, for quickly making judgments. If I told you a professional athlete was going to walk in the room now, who thinks that person would be smaller than them? Please raise your hand. Who thinks that person will be the same size as them? Please raise your hand. You have to raise your hand for one of these. Who thinks that professional athlete will be bigger than them? The rest of your hands all need to go up now. Now, this would be different in the U.S. than, say, in Europe, where the professional athlete might be a football player who might be my size. In American football, he would be bigger. But you didn't know anything fully. You were making a representative judgment about a little bit of information against the pattern that represents. That's how these mental shortcuts work. Availability means the quicker you can bring it up, the more urgent it has a weight. Chernobyl. I didn't give you any facts. That raises a louder alarm than diabetes. You know about that. But Chernobyl has strong imagery, and that gives it emotional power. And there are other factors here. There are also emotional factors that make a risk feel more or less scary. This is a big one for nuclear, as Ivan and I have been talking about. If we trust the people who are supposed to protect us, government, we are less afraid in Finland of nuclear power than if we don't trust the government to protect us in Japan or Russia or the US. And that alone will determine whether we are more or less afraid. If we have control over the situation, we are less afraid. Who uses your mobile phone when you drive? And I would ask you, you would say, because I'm a good driver, or I know it won't happen to me. This is all psychology. And the fact that you have control seduces you into thinking it's less of a risk than it really is. Not very rational and dangerous. Uncertainty. With nuclear radiation, if we can't detect it or we don't understand it, we feel powerless to keep ourselves safe because we don't have the information we would need to protect ourselves. Uncertainty is scary because it denies us what Professor Bauman was saying our lives are about, which is getting control over the fact that we know we're going to die. There are other characteristics there too, and for time I'll rush through them, past them. I highly commend my book as well. It's not here, but I'll give you the name of it in a minute. And the reason is it summarizes what I can't summarize in 22 minutes, what all the fields of science tell us about why our perceptions of risk don't match the facts. Let me close with this challenge. Here's the danger. When we think we're smarter than we are, but we're actually operating out of these emotional factors that let us interpret information about whether it's more or less scary, sometimes our fears don't match the evidence. And that creates a huge hidden risk. And that's the message I hope you all take. And it creates a risk in three ways. We use mobile phones when we drive. And I know this language, and I tell myself, don't be fooled into thinking that because you have control, there's no risk. But when the phone rings and I think it might be my wife, the risk and benefit makes me think I'll answer the phone. We make dangerous choices, personal choices all the time. If we're more worried than we need to be, like about Chernobyl, which the professor studied, the stress hurts us physically. It raises our blood pressure and depresses our immune system. Stress from worrying more than the evidence says we need to is a huge risk by itself, and it comes from these feelings. And the third area is we end up, if we're all afraid of something for similar reasons like nuclear power, it causes cancer. Cancer has high pain and suffering. Pain and suffering makes something scarier. Of course. That doesn't mean the actual physical risk of nuclear radiation is high. It is not, it turns out, but it's frightening. So we demand that Germany drop nuclear power. And you end up, at least for a few years, with more coal. Oops. Bad for your health. The same in the US and Italy and Japan, lots of places. I'm not picking on any one country. This research has been done on many cultures. So, to conclude, the perception gap about risk, because we are not as smart as we think we are, and risk perception is much more emotional and instinctive than we would like to admit, creates dangerous choices and stress and dangerous social choices that aren't optimal for the actual risk. And the perception gap is a huge risk in and of itself. And our challenge, Dr. Schoberg, is exactly what the doctor said. We know this about ourselves. Shame on us if we don't account for this psychology in how we make our personal choices about risk and how we make our social policies about risk, accounting for the fact that our feelings may be leading us to get risk wrong. Thank you. Haven't spilled too much coffee.